So I don't know, Fred. I don't really like what you're trying to do to the language here. Um, I'm uncomfortable with the idea that the words matter, life, and consciousness or mind don't have a meaning, or at least you're saying they don't have any specific, clear, distinct, mathematically or geometrically representable properties, um, or at least that they are vague, abstract categories for what could be represented as mathematical or geometrical notations or formulas of some kind. I think, you know, granted, matter, life, and consciousness aren't very good for doing um, experimental science. They don't tell you much about the details. Missing, for example, is the chemical world. Chemistry is sort of in between physics and biology, and it's a newly discovered realm, between the mineral and plant realms that the ancient world didn't know about, or at least had miscategorized or covered over with a falsely dualistic set of categories. But there's also another way in which I think the ancient cosmology, where you have matter, you have life, you have mind, or, as they would say, you have the mineral, plant, and animal kingdoms. Um, and, of course, you have a whole angelic hierarchy as well, and a set of elemental uh, forces, powers, beings. And this seems pretty naive to us today, but there's a certain way in which it allows us to tell a story about our own existence in the universe, a way that objective science, or positivism, basically, which is, I think, kind of what your approach to language, Fred, seems to me very positivistic, in the sense that it's only interested in, as Descartes said, clear and distinct knowledge of mechanical bodies that can be observed from the outside. Um, you know, that kind of storytelling, or giving an account of things, what we call now science, is uh, it lacks meaningful imagery. The details are perfect and mathematically precise, and in that sense beautiful for the mathematicians who can understand the formulas. But for civilization at large, for the collective identity of our species and so forth, detailed science just doesn't cut it. I mean, it should be a part of any story that we tell, but I think if we're going to tell a story, we're going to need to do something like what the ancients did with their cosmology, by using these archetypal terms, by talking about forms, abstract, universal terms like matter and life and consciousness. I think it's important that we do so, that we struggle through an account of how these clearly evident phenomena or forces or powers in our world relate to one another. It may be hard to point to what matter is, or to point to what life or consciousness is, but it's because they're not empirical concepts that can be reduced to their parts. They are, a priori categories, and the way they relate to one another has to do with, our intuition, and both our sensory intuition of space and time and causality, and our intellectual intuitions of higher truths, of geometry, for example, but also metaphysics, I think. And, I think certainly the ancient way of giving an account of the nature of existence, of the universe, of God and the world and the human being, was naive in some ways, and it needs the correction of modern empirical natural science. But I think, there's just as there was a dark side to the medieval, pre-modern worldview that there's a dark side to the modern techno-industrial scientific world. And I think it's that it has, dissolved our ability to tell a coherent story about the basic meaning of life. And certainly life is it's a vague, nebulous term that also can evoke a lot of wonder when it's used poetically, but it's easy, I think, to dismiss it as useless in the way that you're doing, Fred. But on the other hand, there's a certain poetic or religious way of talking about life, a theological or metaphysical way of talking about life that can be at least provocative, at least interesting, even evocative. It can produce certain imaginative stirrings within your psyche, and for that it has some aesthetic value at least, right? If not even some moral value. Of course, I would want to say that it has truth value as well, but that's a separate argument, perhaps. Just to give an example of the way metaphysics would be done traditionally, I wanted to read a little bit of Sri Aurobindo's The Life Divine. And maybe you have no patience for this, Fred. I'm not sure, but give it a chance. Just want to do 2 or 3 paragraphs. See what you think about it. When we study life as it manifests itself upon earth with matter as its basis, we observe that essentially it is a form of the one cosmic energy, a dynamic movement or current of this universal energy, whether positive or negative, a constant act or play of the force which builds up forms, energizes them by a continual stream of stimulation, and maintains them by an unceasing process of disintegration and renewal of their substance. All that's life. This would tend to show that the natural opposition we make between death and life is an error of our mentality, one of those false oppositions, false to inner truth, though valid in surface practical experience, which, deceived by appearances, it is constantly bringing into the universal unity. Death has no reality except as a process of life. Disintegration of substance and renewal of substance, maintenance of form and change of form, are the constant process of life. Death is merely a rapid disintegration, subservient to life's necessity of change and variation of formal experience. Even in the death of the body, there is no cessation of life. Only the material of one form of life is broken up to serve as material for other forms of life. Similarly, we may be sure, in the uniform law of nature, that if there is in the bodily form a mental or psychic energy, that also is not destroyed, but only breaks out from one form to assume others by some process of metempsychosis or new ensouling of body. All renews itself. Nothing perishes. It could be affirmed, as a consequence, that there is one all-pervading life or dynamic energy, the material aspect being only its outermost movement, that creates all these forms of the physical universe. Life imperishable and eternal, which, even if the whole figure of the universe were quite abolished, would itself still go on existing and be capable of producing a new universe in its place, must indeed, unless it be held back in a state of rest by some higher power, or hold itself back, inevitably go on creating. In that case, life is nothing else than the force that builds and maintains and destroys forms in the world. It is life that manifests itself in the form of the earth as much as in the form of the plant that grows upon the earth, and the animals that support their existence by devouring the life force of the plant, or of each other. All existence here is a universal life that takes form of matter. It might for that purpose hide life process in physical process before it emerges as submental sensitivity and mentalized vitality, but still it would be throughout the same creative life principle. I'll do one more paragraph. It will be said, however, that this is not what we mean by life. We mean a particular result of universal force with which we are familiar, and which manifests itself only in the animal and the plant, but not in the metal, the stone, the gas, operates in the animal cell, but not in the purely physical atom. We must, therefore, in order to be sure of our ground, examine in what precisely consists this particular result of the play of force, which we call life, and how it differs from that other result of the play of force in inanimate things which, we say, is not life. We see at once that there are here on earth three realms of the play of force: the animal kingdom of the old classification to which we belong, the vegetable, and lastly the merely material void, as we pretend, of life. How does life in ourselves differ from the life of the plant? And the life of the plant from the not life, say, of the metal, the mineral kingdom of the old phraseology, or that new chemical kingdom which science has discovered? Ordinarily, when we speak of life, we have meant animal life, that which moves, breathes, eats, feels, desires, and, if we speak of the life of plants, it has been almost as a metaphor rather than a reality, for plant life was regarded as a purely material process rather than a biological phenomenon. Especially, we have associated life with breathing. The breath is life. It was said in every language, and the formula is true if we change our conception of what we mean by the breath of life. But it is evident that spontaneous motion, or locomotion, or motoricity, breathing, eating, are only processes of life and not life itself. They are means for the generation or release of that constantly stimulating energy which is our vitality, and for that process of disintegration and renewal by which it supports our substantial existence. But these processes of our vitality can be maintained in other ways than by our respiration and our means of sustenance. It is a proved fact that even human life can remain in the body and can remain in full consciousness when breathing and the beating of the heart and other conditions formerly deemed essential to it have been temporarily suspended, and new evidence of phenomena has been brought forward to establish that the plant, to which we still deny any conscious reaction, has at least a physical life identical with our own, and even organized essentially like our own, though different in its apparent organization. If that is proved true, we will have to make a clean sweep of our old facile and false conceptions, and get beyond symptoms and externalities to the root of the matter. So, Aurobindo, this Indian yogi, before he became a yogi, he was an Indian revolutionary. But he's telling not only a mythic, but in some sense a philosophical and a physical, in the Greek, classical Greek sense of the term physis, that which grows of itself. For the Greeks, nature was a living and souled process. Plato said the universe was a living thing, or at least it was a likely story that it was a living thing, and that matter really was a kind of unconscious intelligence that was lured forward by certain innate ideas that were mysteriously embedded within it. And Plato had some theological speculations as to how it was embedded, but he recognized and intuited that there was a mysterious unity in some way between idea and material, between form and substance, or between possibility or potentiality and actuality. But yeah, Thanks for